All right, welcome everybody. We're going to get started in a second here. I'm just getting everybody on the list here, so give me a sec. I did realize a little late that I scheduled this at the exact same time that the Buccaneers and the Packers are playing, so if it turns out to be a really good game and it's not a blowout, we may end a little earlier than we normally do. We'll see how it goes. Wasn't even thinking about that when I sent out that email.
Didn't you say something about slides the last time we met?
Yeah. Sixth block still needs to pick slides for this upcoming rotation, so it'll
I don't think fourth block has either.
Fourth block did, I think. Somebody from fourth.
Yeah, we did.
Oh wait,
we did.
Yeah, we were a little bit behind in your class because we were having some pretty awesome debates there. So.
Oh yeah, sorry, I just remembered wrong.
No. But you guys will just pick from the point that we leave off on today, so it's not a big deal.
Was it okay if I tell you the slide I want to pick right now? I was kind of thinking over it.
Sure.
Or do you want me to wait?
Well, if you do it at the end, it'll be a little easier for me to get it locked.
Yeah, okay, I'll wait then.
All right. Give me like 2 seconds here.
Just a quick question. When does the slide rotation end? And the ones that we're picking slides for.
Does anybody remember from fourth block what I said in terms of when the slide rotation kind of was, where we capped it at for this time around?
I thought we said like page 42.
Page 42.
But I'm not quite sure.
Okay, that's probably correct. You'll notice that I did send out the complete rough draft grades, so I'm slowly catching up. Just been kind of inundated lately here. So I'm going to be letting people know this week who is going to the contest, because I've got to get everything kind of done and registered and everything for that. Because that deadline is not going to move for me. Olivia. All right, pretty sure that's everybody. Okay, all right. So if you are a part of my fourth block and we get to a slide that you picked, just say something to me. I have my list out in front of me, but there is a strong possibility that I'll somehow miss you. So Feel free to say something. All right, so I believe in both classes we got to this point. Is that correct? The defeat of the Lakota?
Yes. Well, for our class, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so both classes it seems like we did. All right, so we are going to pick up from here. It's just one tragic story after another in the American West from this point forward. The Nez Perce tribe, which had actually welcomed Lewis and Clark on their epic journey across the great wilderness of the American West previously, he basically, I'm sorry, they basically ended up in a tragic situation, which has kind of gone down in the history of the Indian Wars as one of the most significant events. And that's because of the military skill of Chief Joseph, who, as he was called. They gave him the nickname the Red Napoleon, but essentially his father had told him, do not fight the white man under any circumstances, as he was kind of passing on the mantle of leadership of the tribe to him. But Joseph was basically forced into a conflict anyway, when some of the young warriors from his tribe killed some whites who were prospecting gold on their lands. They had a beautiful valley in Oregon that they had kind of occupied for a very long time. And so this basically put Chief Joseph in a bad spot because he knew that the military would be coming. And so he decided, I'll get that turned on there. He decided that he was going to just leave. And of course, that was the one thing that tribes were not supposed to do, is leave the reservation. And so when he chose to, just make a run for it, you had military units from all over the place trying to keep him from succeeding, because they didn't know where he was going. And they their immediate assumption is that this new leader or this tribe is going to try to start up some big horseback warrior army that we can't beat, so we have to nip it in the bud before it gets too big. And so really Chief Joseph and his people just wanted to get to Canada. That was their goal. And they kept getting surrounded by US military units, and by one skillful kind of maneuver after another, using terrain, using really advanced clever tactics, Chief Joseph was able to get out of these situations again and again and again, basically leading to kind of this rather embarrassing situation where the army, even though they had superior numbers, could not trap him. And his tribe of 800 people, and including many non-combatants, older people, women, children, etc., was able to make this epic 1,200-mile trek through the wilderness of what is now mostly Idaho and Montana, and parts of Oregon. Yeah, Scott, go ahead.
So if we didn't really like the natives in our country anyway, why don't we just let them all go to Canada and then we get free land?
That's a great question. A lot of it is that they have no idea, like, that Chief Joseph, like, when people tell this story, generally speaking, white people are the bad guys, because Chief Joseph is just trying to get to Canada. But from the American point of view, they had just been embarrassed badly by the Lakota, Arapaho, Cheyenne massive horseback army, and they never wanted a repeat of that. So the prime directive was to keep all native tribes on their reservations, and if any tribe leaves the reservation, it's all hands on deck to get them back to where they're supposed to be. So yeah, I mean, it would have been simpler to just let them go to
Yeah.
Canada.
I think though, I think they were thinking, oh, if we let them go to Canada, and then basically then we'll have the trouble of how are we going to fend off an army that doesn't care about international borders,
Yeah, yeah. And again,
and then trouble with Canada, and we already had enough trouble with Canada before.
and Canada has its own issues with natives. I mean, there's
Yeah.
a guy named
It's
Louis.
I'm pretty sure they're like, we already have enough to deal with. We just got done with that situation. We don't want any more.
Well, and Louis Riel is a, like, we're going to talk about him in a little while. He's a Native American rebel leader who does the opposite. He comes from Canada into the United States, and so there's a good amount of Native migration across that border that isn't sanctioned by either country, but neither country really has complete control over their Native populations at this point. So essentially, uh, Chief Joseph really impresses everybody with his military expertise, his cunning. But every time he wins a battle, winter gets closer, and they do get into winter, and he loses more of his warriors, and so they get 40 miles from the border of Canada. And finally, the army forces have them completely surrounded. Chief Joseph is unable to, get out of this one, and he is forced to surrender. And he makes this famous speech where he says, "Hear me, my chiefs. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." And just, you know, it's gone down as one of the great speeches from, a Native American military leader, etc. So that is Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce. And yeah, it just really kind of an incredible story. All right, so let me move on here. All right, so one of the really powerful stories from this time period is the attempt by the U.S. government to break the will of the Native American people, and to make it so they'll never be able to resist the United States again. And they do that by saying to them, once they have them on the reservations and they have them kind of addicted to government handouts of food, you have to give us your children. And that we're going to send them to boarding school, and you won't see them again for a while until they graduate. And at these boarding schools, they were forbidden to speak their native language. They were taught trades, so they could assimilate into white society. And by the time they got home from these Native American boarding schools, uh, they were embarrassed to participate in things that were related to their culture, and the kind of the cycle of culture that had been, passed on from generation to generation was broken. And there were a lot of bad things that happened at these schools. There's a government report that was done later that kind of really discredited what was done, and then the government tried to later undo it to a certain extent, but that's much later. But this is a concerted effort by the government to break the warrior culture of these tribes, so that they're unable to really ever uh, do what they were doing before again. So that is the Native American boarding schools, and just kind of a tragic, situation in many, many ways. Um, and something that the native tribes have never really forgotten, but it was effective because there never was one of those massive horseback armies again that could threaten the United States. So let's see here. Yes. All right. So oh, and they also tried to Christianize many of these children as well, as a way to kind of further assimilate them into American culture. Something that takes place across the ocean over in the over in kind of the European medical and scientific fields is some really important advances in the understanding of disease. Two people in particular really contribute to kind of what becomes known as the germ theory of disease. Um, uh, Anton van Leeuwenhoek was the guy who had invented the microscope many years before, and of course we have to give him some credit for showing us the microscopic world. But really, Louis Pasteur, who is a French chemist, um, uh, created fermentable drinks where he would heat up a drink that would go sour in order to kill off the microorganisms that were living in the drink, and that would keep it from going sour. So that process of pasteurization is still used today to preserve drinks like milk. And an English surgeon by the name of Joseph Lister um, also attempted to kill microorganisms when prior to doing surgery by sterilizing his instruments, his medical instruments, with carbolic acid. And of course, this greatly increased the success of surgeries. So it was a little too late to save all of those soldiers who were shot during the Civil War and suffered, terrible, consequences from, bullet wounds to the arms and the legs. But it did basically make it so there was a reduced incidence of disease or infection pretty dramatically. Yeah, Zach and Nick.
So, so are you saying that germs were invented in the 1870s?
No, they knew that there were little microorganisms. Ever since Anton van Leeuwenhoek had created the microscope in the 1600s, the world of the microorganism had been something that like people could look at. It's just that they hadn't made the connection yet between diseases and microorganisms. They hadn't realized that that was what was causing these diseases, that people didn't know what diseases were, essentially. Nick, go ahead. What were you going to say?
How long was it before like the germ theory caught on? Because I know probably at the time it was very hard to believe, or just kind of far out, that it was like small little organisms that you couldn't see were like causing you to be sick.
This is really where it does. Is in the late 1870s is really where the germ theory of disease becomes, because of the success of both Pasteur and Lister. This is where it becomes really widely accepted by a number of medical professionals, really across the world. Ethan, go ahead.
Wasn't this technically different from, the act? I think before doctors would commonly wash their hands, though technically around the time that came up, germ theory wasn't really as established.
That
It's like
was
sort of two
that was
different things that kind of
that was
converge.
Florence Nightingale in the 1850s during the Crimean War, where English and French troops were fighting on the Crimean Peninsula in um, Russia again, with the Ottomans and whatnot. the Russians, and she basically was just a super like anal clean person, just constantly had to clean everything. And they noticed that her hospital tent, the place where soldiers went to be treated when they were with her, had a massively reduced number of deaths due to infection.
I'm guessing then they thought that, oh, it must be something to do with the cleaning, not really understanding that it was germs underlying.
Really, I mean, yeah, like just, thinking about, organisms that small, all working, kind of in concert to create, these diseases is a bit of a leap, I guess, for people.
Yeah. Well, it is kind of hard to try and make people believe something you can't see. It does take a while for that to happen.
Yeah. So it just definitely a real revolution in medical thinking. Olivia, go ahead. Olivia, did you have a question?
When it says developed vaccines artificially, what exactly does that mean?
So developing artificial vaccines is where you're going to have a vaccine that you're not going to like just invent something that's a vaccine. You're going to heat up a virus to the point where it's almost dead, or something along those lines, or you're going to take something that is a similar disease and you're going to use it to inoculate people against a much more deadly disease. And again, we're kind of wandering out of my area of expertise a little bit here as we get into the medical field. So, I do know that there were some advances made in vaccines and that Pasteur was a part of that. But in terms of the actual science of it, I'm a little, that I don't know exactly what was done there. Nick, what were you going to say?
Unrelated, but also kind of related, Listerine was named after Joseph Lister.
Yes, it is. Yeah. And I don't know who was the clever marketer that came up with that. But that, that was kind of a neat, it's just kind of like Charles Goodyear, the guy who vulcanized rubber. There was later a tire company that named in his honor. I don't know if we've gotten to Goodyear yet in this class, but
Yeah, we talked about it in the last package.
did we? Okay, yeah. So there was a tire company that later just kind of went back to him and used his name as the name for their company. So very similar in that way. Olivia, did you have anything else you wanted to add? Olivia? No. Okay. It looks like you just forgot to put your hand down. Ethan, did you have anything else you wanted to add, or did you just forget to put your hand down?
Yeah, I noticed it's like a use of carbolic acid as an antiseptic. I'm guessing, wouldn't that also come from like fermentation processes, inferred from that at least? As I know there's some where carbolic acid is produced.
You're wandering a little out of my area of expertise. So I'm not sure how carbolic acid.
All I know about it is like a very weak acid.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know what role that plays in fermentation. So it's a good question, actually.
It's like a side product, I think.
Yeah, something you'd want to ask your chemistry teacher because they would know. All right. So we have some interesting developments in kind of on the cultural front and the religious front. There was a very active feminist by the name of Victoria Woodhull, who kind of had a sister who was one of those scandal scarred ladies, I guess you could say, of the time, kind of similar to like a Kim Kardashian nowadays or something like that. Her name was Tennessee Claflin. And they both kind of in tandem, in their own ways, became this leaders of this rebellion among some women against traditional morals, especially when it came to marriage. And this became known as the new morality. So they advocated more free love and less stringent divorce laws. So that meant that they were advocating for
like less of a restriction against, sex before marriage, and more freedom for women to leave terrible husbands. Of course, there were some defenders of morality who were on the other side of this debate, and it is kind of ironic how this all plays out. The Reverend Henry Ward Beecher was the most prominent of those, and Anthony Comstock was another. But when Woodhull, who apparently was a relatively good detective in her own right, accused Reverend Beecher himself of adultery, and was later found out to be correct, it became one of the biggest scandals of the decade. And uh, the two sisters essentially were able to kind of come out on top, and move things a little in favor of a more equal standing between men and women. So this is what becomes known as the new morality. During this time, there was a preacher who grew up very poor and ended up getting converted to Christianity at the age of 18 years old, by a Sunday school teacher by the name of Edward Kimball. He had received a very imperfect education, but he understood poor people. So he went out and began preaching to poor people in the city of Chicago, and kind of started a ministry in a Sunday school class that grew so large that he ended up founding a big church. And Dwight Moody became one of the most talented preachers of his time, and ended up founding the Moody Bible Institute in 1889. And really, his appeal was just to kind of emphasize the love and forgiveness aspect of the the Gospels in a way that people could understand. And so that really is, kind of his legacy. And of course, the Moody Bible Institute is still around, and it's still a big influence in Christian circles even today. So that is Dwight L. Moody. And kind of also kind of following along those lines in terms of religious innovators and whatnot. You have basically a brand new religion being born, because Christians do not consider Christian Science to be Christian at all. They consider it to be a completely separate religion. But Mary Baker Eddy published a book in 1875 called Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, and basically kind of started this church in Boston called the Christian Science Church. And she said that you could heal your body in a scientific way by seeing that the material world is an illusion, and that there is kind of this greater order in the universe which can be used to heal physical ailments. So of course it's going to draw people who have physical ailments to it. And of course she also advocates communion with God, but in a less Christian way, even though she does retain the name Christian in the name of her religion. Yes, Ethan.
I'm just saying, this sounds awfully similar to something like that would happen later from the 70s to all the way to the 90s. I think, what was it called again? Is the one that basically is the one where, the whole alien thing. Though the main thing about them is that they believed that you could get to heaven on a physical level, and like there was going to be a great spaceship to take us up there.
I know what you're talking about, but I can't remember the name of it. I know what you're talking about, though. I do remember that. Yeah, I don't remember the name of it.
I'm saying it sort of connects the same thing of you can use real physical things to, you know, basically in sort of Christian ideals that kind of make it kind of iffy with the church.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely yeah. I mean, it's its own kind of take on things, right? And people have to decide what they want to have faith in, and uh, mainline Christians have just said that, like, similar to what they've said about Mormonism, this is not a Christian denomination. This is a separate religion, which is their right to say. Braden, what were you going to say?
Okay, so that little image at the top right, it says "raise the dead."
Yeah.
So did they actually think they could raise the dead, or was that like some kind of religious thing where they were like, oh, like they're talking about the afterlife or
They
something?
believed that you could, but there is no evidence of it ever happening, obviously. So, yeah, they believed that it was possible for people to do it, though, if they were if they were able to attain a high enough understanding of the universe. It's almost in some ways like an Eastern religion, because it's not about how much faith you have, it's about how um how much you understand. Like it's almost like a certain amount of enlightenment. Like when you suddenly realize the truth, you can then manipulate things, like kind of like the Matrix or something like that. So all right, so that takes us to Alexander Graham Bell and the invention of the telephone, which really is one of the great communication advances in history. And really, Alexander Graham Bell was motivated more to help deaf people. He was trying to imitate what an eardrum did, which is picking up vibrations in the air and turning them into electrical signals, which is what your eardrum does all the time. And once he was able to actually create this kind of diaphragm that did that, he realized that he was onto something that would literally change the world, because he could take that and combine it with some other inventions to produce a new form of communication. So he takes the liquid transmitter from Dr. Elisha Gray and Thomas Edison's electrodynamic receiver, and kind of puts them together with this diaphragm and microphone that were all part of him, basically, engineering the transfer of sound to electrical signals and then back from electrical signals to sound again, kind of in reverse engineering it via the same method. And he simply then just took it and stuck it on either end of a telegraph line. And because when you modulate the amount of current, I believe, you're able to kind of create those vibrations on the other side. He was able to actually make it where he would speak into his microphone on one side, and it would then come out, the voice would come out of a speaker on the other side. And the great moment, supposedly, according to the way the story supposedly goes, is that he was in his lab and he had been tinkering with it, and he had spilled battery acid on himself. And he said to his lab assistant, "Mr. Watson, come here." And Mr. Watson came into the room, and his face was pale, and he's like, I just spilled battery acid on myself. It's okay, I'm fine." He's like, "No, your voice came through. It came through the receiver." And that was the moment that they realized that they had actually succeeded in this this effort that they had been kind of working on for some time. And of course, then he took his invention to the Centennial Exposition in 1876, where they showed off inventions from around the country. And when they did, um, it looked amazing to people. People were just like, wow. His booth was like the most crowded booth at the exposition, just about. And of course, the popularity that he got from that like public exposure led him to then start his own company, because he of course owned all the patents, and that became the Bell Telephone Company, which was founded in 1877. So Ethan, you were first. Go ahead.
Wasn't it like many other inventions in this time? It kind of took a bit to get really useful. I'm guessing because wasn't there over the distance of wires, the sound would get worse and worse in quality, so you
Yes.
couldn't really use it very
I mean,
far.
even if you listen to like recordings from the 1940s, when they had much more advanced equipment than they did back in the 1870s, you can tell there's a real significant difference in the sound quality. So yes, you are correct.
Technically, probably most of them thought, well, we already have these telegraphs. Why would I need a telephone when I can still get a message across?
But you could have a conversation. You could
Yeah.
talk, and then the other person.
Yeah, I'm guessing at this time is considered one of those, very expensive commodity type things for rich people. It's like, oh, look, I can talk to you from upstairs.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, these things often are the playthings of the rich, before they end up becoming, uh, you know, more commonly used. But as people get excited about them, they pass into common use. Boyer, what were you going to ask?
How long was it before these became like standard commodities, like where they were using them regularly across the country?
Essentially, a company would have to establish telephone lines. It's just like the telegraph. The telegraph had to grow with the companies that established the lines. So it just depends on what part of the country you're talking about. If you're talking about places like New York City, it's relatively quick. Within a decade or so, there were telephones in lots of locations, and passing into common use more quickly. But the further away from like the kind of very centers of you know innovation and urban life you got, the less common it was to see phones. So
Did the government help with the infrastructure, like setting up the infrastructure for telephones, or was it solely private companies that just got permission?
yeah, it was private. So unlike the government assistance in sending telegraph lines across the West, etc., for the most part, early telephone usage was established by individuals, private individuals, and companies only. So eventually there will be some government help with infrastructure, but generally speaking, it is privately financed at the time. Ethan, go ahead.
So I'm guessing the main driver for these, types of communication devices is mainly in like New York. I need to get stock information before anyone else does.
There's all kinds of
Yeah.
motivations. I mean, like
I mean, I've seen that one as like a very large one, especially because if you can get the information quicker, you can make more money.
Sure, and businesses are going to realize the value of the telephone.
Yeah,
And
because
make
technically
the
you
best-
wouldn't need to translate like on a sheet. You wouldn't have to translate a telegraph message. You could just hear it.
right. I mean, the more pertinent it is to your particular business, the more the business is willing to make the investment in the technology, which allows the company to grow, because the company grows with the contracts that it establishes with individuals and businesses. But Bell would become a millionaire And of course, Bell Telephone Company would become a mega company, with branches all over the country. So it is definitely an invention that changed the world and brought the world closer via communication. So that is the invention of the telephone. And that takes us to the story of immigration during this time. And most immigrants who came to America across the Atlantic and passed through the immigration station at Ellis Island. And by the way, if you ever decide to do an ancestry.com kind of little, thing on your family tree, you might end up finding, the actual certificate from when one of the members of your family tree came across the Atlantic and went through Ellis Island, because all of those massive waves of European immigrants, they ended up going through New York City and getting processed through that station there. But essentially the way that worked was you would be inspected for defects and diseases, and the United States could reject people who were not going to be a quote benefit to society. If you were going to be a burden to society, and society was going to have to support you, and instead of you being a valuable contributing member, the country could reject you, and the United States did that on a regular basis. But if you were able to pass the inspection, then you went through this process, which was a relatively quick process called naturalization, where you learned some basic facts about the country and democracy, and then you swore an oath to uphold the Constitution, etc. And we had, of course, millions of people going through that process and getting naturalized and becoming citizens. And oftentimes, we've discussed this before, but just to kind of put a fine point on it, for those immigrants that just barely made it across, they just had enough money to get here. They ended up in ethnic boroughs in a place like New York City. And of course, that same process is happening on the West Coast in a city like San Francisco. And so the the process was very difficult for people as they were trying to establish themselves in the country. So they would have to find friends or relatives or friendly people from their country who would give them a place to stay for a little bit until they could get on their feet financially. They would have to find a job in one of the factories. And so there were these large buildings known as tenements. There were these huge apartment buildings, and people would be sleeping in these little flats, and there would be they'd literally be packed like sardines on the floor almost. And then families would work all day in what were known as sweatshops. They would be given a certain number of pieces of cloth to assemble into a pair of pants, and get paid per completed pair of pants they produced. All day, while the dad was at the factory working all day as well. And that was how they were able to make ends meet and put a roof over their head. And it was a difficult life. It was tough. It was so hot in those buildings oftentimes during the summer that people would go out and sleep on the roof. The sanitation was terrible. There's not very many bathrooms per floor, just difficult conditions, to say the least. And there were places where, if you didn't have friends or relatives to stay with, you could pay a nickel to sleep at, a place, and they just had lines and lines of cots. And then you would just pay your nickel, sleep in the cot, and then go back to work the next day. And just a very rough kind of, uh, slow start for a lot of people who came across and were not, didn't already have money to go and like establish a farm out west or something like that. Yes, Ethan.
Was there a pushback to this, like you would see more in like modern immigration, or was it different?
You will see it during the progressive movement. So we are getting closer to the 1880s, 1890s, where you're going to see people start to look at the like terrible conditions that are created in these cities and just say, hey, the government really needs to do something here because this is just, it's beyond bad. And there will be photojournalists and activists who will push for reform, and people who will go and start community centers. We'll talk about the settlement house movement. And those are all going to kind of alleviate some of the misery that people face in these conditions. Faith, go ahead.
I know that the reputation that sweatshops will have like becomes really, really bad with like labor abuse and stuff like that, and a lot of unethical practice for the workers. So when will it start that sweatshops and the factories and all that stuff will be looked down upon and the government actually steps in and does something? When does that start happening?
Again, it's right around the time of the progressive movement. There is a progressive journalist by the name of Jacob Riis. He's one of a group of progressive journalists known as the Muckrakers, who will create a book full of photographs called How the Other Half Lives, which go into the tenements and just show you in pictures, the horrors of just how bad it is in the poorer quarters of the city. And that is really where public opinion begins to turn. And there is a push to regulate, the people who own the buildings more, the people who own the companies. Of course, labor unions are going to produce big gains for workers in terms of pay and hours and whatnot, and that's going to improve the quality of people's lives as well. So it's kind of it's a process in tandem, but late 1800s is like 1890s in particular is kind of the short answer to your question. Kenzie, you're next. Go ahead.
I was gonna ask about how much did they make per each pair of pants?
Per pair of pants, off the top of my head, I could not tell you. You would have to look that up. That I know that the dollar was worth quite a bit more back then. So you'd say, oh, like if I looked it up and they made like 3 cents per pair, how horrible. That's like slave labor in China or something like that. But you have to realize how much more valuable the dollar was. Like the dollar, the value of the dollar has been inflated dramatically ever since we've gone off the gold standard. So the dollar back then is worth a lot more than the dollar now. So if you do look it up, just keep that in mind that they were getting like literal starvation wages, but just remember that there is a difference in terms of what it's worth, in terms of what you could buy with it, comparatively speaking. Did you have anything else you wanted to add?
Oh no, sorry, I forgot to put my hand down.
Oh, okay, no problem. Ethan, go ahead.
So, questions about the Hudson. Was it always polluted, or did it just start getting polluted right about then?
As more and more factories spring up in New York City, it's going to be like any major city.
It's like eventually it's gonna get a legend, that legendary status of so polluted you can catch it on fire.
Right. I mean, the Des Plaines River in Chicago, kind of parts of Lake Michigan are very similar. I mean, they're just unbelievably badly polluted. And that's just the way it is in industrial areas. There really isn't a lot of push to protect the environment until we get to Teddy Roosevelt, and that's like right at the turn of the century. So you'll see that when we get to the conservation and preservation movements. So, all right. So that takes us. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. I see another hand. Faith, go ahead.
I just wanted to say I looked it up. $1 in the year of 1870 is equivalent to 1988 today. So yeah, there's an increase of over $18 from then to now. So yeah, if you made $1 a day, it would be 19 bucks a day. So that'd be interesting, but still.
All right. Well, you know, that of course is, but just remember that, like, for a lot of these families that come over, establishing that first generation foothold is tough. It is a back-breaking, you know, just work your whole life kind of existence. And a lot of people just put their shoulder to the wheel and just did it. And they laid that foundation for their children and, you know, grandchildren, etc., to build upon. And of course, you know, it is going to really just make the country stronger in many ways. But of course, the you know, even if the initial immigrants themselves don't necessarily get the full benefits of American capitalism because they're kind of at the bottom rung, their children can, or their grandchildren can, and to a certain extent, that is what motivates them. So just something to keep in mind in terms of, like, you know, how powerful this is. But that is the story of immigration, which again is the part of every. If you are Caucasian, if you are white, this is part of your family story. You know, on the European side, and of course, if you have Asian blood in your family, then most likely that same story, which plays out in San Francisco, is part of your family story as well. And it is interesting to go back and look. You know, like we know the big broad strokes here, but it's interesting to go back and look in particular. How does this relate to you? So if you haven't, like, I know that it costs money and everything, but if you ever get a chance to do something kind of family tree oriented like ancestry.com, I really encourage it, because it really makes a personal connection to all of that history that we're discussing. Yeah, go ahead, Ethan.
I think the majority of where, you know, Japanese immigrants to the United States came around this time to San Francisco. You know, mainly the reason to escape, you know, the Meiji Restoration and the whole imperialization.
Whenever there's upheaval in a country, oftentimes you'll see a big wave of immigration. I mean, China goes through an incredible, you know, period of upheaval in the 1800s. You know, opium wars, Taiping rebellion, all kinds of horrible stuff. And so there's waves and waves of immigration as people are fleeing um, the oppressive circumstances in one country, hoping that they will find better circumstances elsewhere. And some do, and some, it's not as great as they thought it would be. But, you know, for their children, for their grandchildren, it becomes that. So that is kind of one of the great themes of history at this point. And it takes us to that back to that thing we were talking about earlier. You know, we were talking about the waves of immigration, the old immigration versus the new immigration. So there is a big wave of immigration that hits America in the 1880s and 1890s. It's different in character from a lot of the previous waves of immigration from before the Civil War, and like the waves right after the Civil War, like in the 1870s, because it's no longer people from Northern and Western Europe. It's people from Southern and Eastern Europe that are now the majority of the immigrants coming into the country. And again, this is all because of events in Europe. Okay. It's all because of, you know, the upheaval going on in these various locations. But the new immigration is going to include groups such as the Italians, the Russians, Slavic peoples from places like Austria-Hungary and the Balkans. You know, various ethnic groups would include the Serbs, Croats, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Slovenians, Albanians, Greeks, and others. But a lot of these immigrants are coming across without money saved up to go out west. They're not like those German and Scandinavian immigrants, many of whom earlier planned ahead, came across with enough money to not only get here, but to establish themselves as farmers out west. Instead, they're basically just barely getting here and then kind of having to create that economic foothold and work their way up. And of course, that creates these large ethnic neighborhoods and the resulting kind of backlash against these various ethnicities, the Italians in particular. Yes, Scott, go ahead.
Did all these people from a bunch of different countries having to like stay really close to each other result in like a bunch of diseases spreading? Or
The sanitation system is overwhelmed in New York City numerous times. The city is constantly having to go back and redo their sewer system, their water distribution system, etc. And so there are waves of disease that do spread throughout the city, but they have a health and sanitation department that's the sole job of those people is to track down where disease outbreaks are occurring. And now that they kind of know about the germ theory of disease, they're able to more effectively address, like how to stop diseases from continuing to spread. They know about like water supplies getting infected, things like that. So it's not as bad as it was in years previous, just because of the understanding that they have currently. So yes, Ethan.
So I'm guessing that seeing like a tenant building get quarantined was quite common.
It happened, yeah. And like, I don't know if I put a slide in this packet on her or not, but there is a particular immigrant who served as a cook by the name of Typhoid Mary, who was a carrier for typhoid fever, but wasn't affected by it herself. But as she cooked for various families, she would spread the disease. And the disease detectives in the Department of Health in New York City were so good at their jobs that they were able to track her down and realize that she was the carrier. And they said, you can never work as a cook again. We don't want to imprison you because you didn't commit a crime, but you're spreading disease, so you have to agree to these conditions in order to keep your freedom. And then she changed her name and went back to being a cook, and so then they had to imprison her. It's kind of an interesting story, but I have a slide made up on it. I just don't know if I included it in this packet or not. But that story is like right around the turn of the century. So as time goes by, they get better and better at kind of addressing those concerns, because those are concerns. But people are voting for city officials, and that's one of the big issues that a lot of those poorer people's votes are going to go towards. So city officials are under pressure from voters to fix these issues, and they do.
I think also a consequence of, the government being better and being more precise of finding where diseases come is that technically, I think in a later case in wartime, they could suppress if a disease comes out because they would know like with the Spanish flu, for example, how it's technically not Spanish, it's actually from Kansas.
Well, okay, and again, it's debated as to where exactly that started. Okay, so yes, there is a theory that it came from an army base in Kansas, but there's also other alternative theories. The Spanish flu name came from the British coverage of it, because the British wanted to kind of like make sure they didn't get the blame. So they blamed it on an outbreak in Spain. They
Yeah, technically it's like Spain was one of the neutral powers technically in World War One, so it kind of got the short end of the stick.
Yeah, and it just happened to be a place where there was an early outbreak, and so then people just piled on. But there's a theory that it was actually the trenches where the disease really got going, because it was the perfect petri dish, like chemicals, blood, you know, all kinds of, you know, like bodily waste and dead bodies, and just it was the perfect laboratory for a mutation. So
Also, I'm guessing with this new wave of, European immigration, this is where we start to see, even more cultural injections into big cities like New York, and the whole culture as a city starts to get more confusing, and usually the majority of Americans don't like when culture gets confusing.
yeah,
Sometimes there's pushbacks to those things.
right, yeah. Yes, go ahead, Dylan. What were you going to say?
Back then, were there any programs that allowed people to stay in the U.S. like anchor babies we have now?
Technically, 14th Amendment, if you're born on U.S. soil, you are a U.S. citizen, and that has been the official interpretation of the government, including if you are born to diplomats on diplomatic soil, so to speak. You know, like a U.S. embassy is considered U.S. soil. Um, so, is there an issue with people coming across the border without going through immigration and then having a baby and having that baby born? Not as much, because there isn't large waves of immigration coming from places like Mexico. There's just waves of immigration, coming in through our coasts. And of course, all of those people have to go through those immigration stations, either in New York City or San Francisco. Yes, Faith, go ahead.
I was just gonna ask, were green card marriages like a big thing yet?
Green card marriages, not that I'm aware of. So again, as time has gone by, our immigration system has become more complex. Back at this time, there is a pretty much wide open kind of, if you can get here, you can be a citizen kind of thing. Like, there isn't, as long as you can be a productive member of society and work, like, there is no restriction. It's not until we get to the Red Scare of the 1920s, I'm sorry, right post World War I, that we start to really see immigration restrictions start to be put in a large way on various populations, and then the system gets way more complicated as time goes by after that. Yes, Ethan.
Yeah, we usually see patterns when, urbanization and industrialization is ramping up very quickly. Immigration gets a lot looser in
Well,
terms, it's just mainly getting workers.
It just so happens that it was like the perfect storm. Like, in other words, all of these factors all kind of happened at the same time. Like, we had an open immigration policy, and it basically was, just an open immigration policy, not necessarily because, factory owners were pressuring the government to make it such, but it was just because it was our philosophy at the time.
I'm guessing also when, industry started to slow down a bit, and
as jobs become more like, as people start to worry about their
like
jobs,
the demand for jobs started to rise more than there was supply for jobs.
well,
Like,
here's
usually that's when
it's kind of the opposite. Is basically that you had this massive labor pool, and the massive labor pool was being fed by two factors. It was being fed by people coming into the country, but also people who were just coming to the cities from the rural areas. So urbanization and immigration were creating this massive labor pool. So when factories started up, they had the perfect incubator, the perfect conditions to grow in, because labor was so cheap. That is the biggest expense for a factory, is labor. I mean, that's why you still see, people like saying, okay, we're going to shift our factory over to China, or shift our factory over to Mexico, where labor
so
is cheaper.
I'm
Because
guessing those labor unions played a part.
we're getting to
in that.
we're getting to the age where labor unions are really going to start get going, and that is going to be a factor in wages rising and things like that. But right now, you could pay people really cheap wages, because there's so many people looking for jobs that it's like, it's basically the factory owner's market, so to speak. And it's not necessarily because anybody planned it that way. It just, all of the circumstances just kind of come together to create this perfect storm where factories have like the best possible like situation in which they could grow, which of course is going to spark what we call the second industrial revolution, which is really centered in the United States. And there's so much else that goes on into that, but we'll be getting to it in a little bit. But that was, it's an excellent conversation on that. And so, kind of following on what a lot of you guys are asking about, there is this social side to this as well. So one of the great authors of the time, a guy who we keep referring back to him like as we go throughout the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, Mark Twain. He referred to this as the Gilded Age, which is, I don't know if you've ever seen like a gilded box, but like a gilded box is, it's a wooden box that has a thin layer of gold on the top of it. And so like the vast majority of the box is just wood. It's just common material. But then on the very, very top, there is this thin layer of gold. And Mark Twain, I think, picked a very apt metaphor when he called it the Gilded Age for society, because, and this is again a criticism that is still, brought by politicians like Bernie Sanders and others, where you have this rich upper crust, like really rich upper crust, which is only going to get richer because they're constantly scheming as to how to continue to game the system even more than they're already gaming it. While you also have this massive underclass of people who are poor and are, many of them desperately poor, like just barely making it. And so you have this incredible contrast. And so again, let's just talk about the top layer for a second. The way to get to that mega rich status, which these guys were all very competitive and they were all trying to get there, was to establish a monopoly. And we've only talked about one kind of monopoly so far. Does anybody remember what is the monopoly that is kind of the first monopoly? Yes, Ethan. And I see another hand there as well.
Isn't basically when you take all this, you have to have a supply of something like a physical commodity, and then to gain a significant portion of it, basically, just set prices to whatever you want. But I think, isn't there the downside of that is it has to be a physical commodity that can be traded?
A physical commodity that can be, okay. You're thinking more advanced in terms of monopolies, because we're getting to that age where people are going to establish these nationwide monopolies, which we haven't quite gotten to yet. Although we did talk about the meatpacking industry as one exception, which I have the guys from the meatpacking industry on here. But
One thing also wasn't else is like, after Vanderbilt, it was like local monopolies,
right,
in like districts.
Geographic monopoly is what we call them. So Elizabeth, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I was just going to say about Vanderbilt and the railroad monopoly in New York was one example that we talked about before.
All right. So why is it that you can create a monopoly in a local area? Like what is it that allows a railroad to create a monopoly without having to go nationwide?
Well, just because you can't have, there's like a set amount that can be within, and once you own all of them, you own all of them. There's not a lot of space to build a whole bunch of new railroads and stuff like that. So
right. And if people want to go through your particular area, say you own all the railroads in the state of New York, they have to pay your rates. Like you have what's called a geographic monopoly, because you have locked down all of the railroad transportation in a particular geographic area. And of course, if you're able to do that, like Cornelius Vanderbilt did, you can just make an incredible amount of money. He became ultra wealthy, and everybody was like, that's the ticket. That's what I want to do. Okay, I see a bunch of hands here. Ethan, you were next. Go ahead.
I'm guessing that the next part comes from what happens when all the railroad land gets bought up, and how am I gonna make a monopoly now?
Well, okay, and again, geographic monopolies have their issues, but what what these people do is a lot of them are run very risky kind of businesses where they try to they sink all their profits into trying to like outcompete everybody else in the area so they can establish that geographic monopoly.
I'm guessing their like internal reasoning for that is like, if I don't do this, they're gonna squash me.
Well, okay, yeah, it's a cutthroat, business world is incredible.
Yeah, I think they also still do geographic monopolies with internet providers these days.
Okay, yeah, I mean,
Like New York City and stuff, where like some districts you can only get like AT&T, some districts you can only get Comcast.
Yeah, I mean there are still places where you can do it, yes, through cable providers and other things. So yeah, excellent point. Olivia, go ahead.
Um, at the bottom where it talks about the meat kings.
Yes, your internet connection must be really slow because it's stretched out. Like it's so.
Was that like the one topic?
We talked about this earlier when we talked about the meatpacking industry and cattle ranching and the meatpacking industry. And meatpacking is one of the industries which is going to go nationwide, and kind of Swift and Armour. Gustavus Swift and Philip Armour are going to establish one of the first nationwide monopolies, but it's not complete. It's not like they run everybody out of business. They just establish a very big company that is effectively competing with local butchers all across the country. But we haven't gotten to the age of Rockefeller yet, where he deliberately runs every single other company that does what he does out of business. But we're getting there. So good question. Nick, go ahead.
What was to stop what was there to stop a bunch of the rich entrepreneurs from just like buying up like other businesses per se, or just like going around and like just keep monopolizing like everything around them? Like, what stopped them from doing that?
The answer is nothing.
Wow.
Basically, the government at this time, remember we talked about this at the very beginning slide of this packet. The government at this time is engaged in what we call unfettered capitalism. Like, in other words, the US government does not get involved in the business world. I mean, they'll enforce contracts through the courts. Like, so if you make a contract, you have to honor it. But as far as regulating businesses and telling businesses what to do, that is like anathema. That is like against everything America stands for. We're not going to do it, etc. It's just that's kind of how it plays out. So we'll see. You'll see how this goes. I hate to anticipate what we're coming to too much, so I'll kind of leave it at that. But essentially, we are going to get to the point where the government is going to step in, and that's when we have the situation like we have nowadays, where companies are told, no, you can't do that. That is not true in the late 1800s. Like, there is no regulation until we get to like Grover Cleveland. So Braden, go ahead.
So you said this is kind of an era where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And I've heard that said a lot about like the Great Depression, where like the gap between the rich and the poor just grows immense. So like, do these two eras have like a lot of like similarities going on?
Right now, to a certain extent, all boats are rising, so to speak. Like, in other words, everybody's making money, so everybody's okay. During the Great Depression, it's a little different. We have lots and lots of businesses going under, people being thrown out of work and being unemployed and being unable to find a job. And so there is a definite contrast there. This is like more of an overall, like the gap between, I guess if you wanted to like make that phrase a little bit more accurate, you could say the gap between the rich and the poor grows much wider, is probably the best way to put that. But yeah, that's kind of where things are at. So it's definitely kind of an interesting time. Ethan, you were next. Or unless Braden, unless you had something else you wanted to say. No, okay. Ethan, go ahead.
Wasn't the still dominant world stock exchange at this point was the Paris Stock Exchange?
London is
Or
really,
London.
yeah, London is really the center of the financial world at this time.
I'm guessing was the American Stock Exchange, like, did it exist, but still kind of was the backdrop?
We're a peripheral part of the financial world, although like there is a lot of opportunity. Like, in other words, if you want to be a person who makes a lot of money as an investor, you look for deals. You look for things like where it's like, it's like if you bought Apple back when Apple was like super cheap, like when Steve Jobs was first getting started, and you bought like a whole bunch of shares. Yeah, that like the American Stock Exchange is attractive to investors because there are so many new businesses, and there are a lot of quote unquote deals, because if you are savvy enough and you are well informed enough to pick the right companies, you are going to pick companies that are going to grow, and your initial investment in that stock is going to astronomically increase.
So yeah, that's like the early stages of the stock exchange. I was thinking is like, was there ever a point where it got to like the later stages where literally you could just sit and you would make money, like as a large company?
When the whole market is going up, like that's just generally the mantra, is just invest in almost anything. Like that's what they said in the 1920s. It's like it almost doesn't even matter.
Yeah, but I'm guessing like in this time there's still an inherent, sort of a risk factor. You wanted to, bet more risky. Where nowadays it's just like, oh yeah, that company's just kind of gonna grow forever, and they're just gonna sit and make money. So
well, a lot of it has to do with how intelligent the leadership is. Like Bezos, you got to give him credit for making Amazon into what it is. Like it's a lot of it is just his savvy, his business savvy. Same thing is going to go for Rockefeller. Same thing is going to go for all of these great business leaders. It's their savvy that, so like if you're an investor and you can pick these people out, these leaders, you can see in the way they're running these companies early on that this person is,
I'm guessing the main factor of this is competition. Is that when competition's high, everybody's sort of, fine with these sort of things, and they're easy to take these risks. But when competition's low, usually things become more stagnant, and then people start to dislike the market. I may be going off on a rant here, but
right. I mean, there's usually, unless there's some kind of massive shock to the system and everybody's panicking and pulling out of the market, usually there's lots of investors who are looking to make money, because it's like, I don't want to work, so I'm just gonna invest in something and watch my money grow, and then that way I won't ever have to do any actual work. I can just live off of the profits my investments are making. That's the philosophy of the investing class. So why go and slave away at some job when you can invest and live off your investments?
I'm guessing, getting back a bit on topic, is the Gilded Age is where still most Americans aren't invested in the stock market.
If you have the means, yeah. Like, is there a middle class? Are you saying, is there a middle class? Like,
I'm saying, like, yeah, obviously there was. I just think it was a bit smaller, so
right,
still.
Right. The middle class is small, yet it is growing. Yes, and so it hasn't become like the dominant factor that it later becomes in our economy. But right now we're just seeing this massive gap increase between really, really rich people and everybody else who's kind of in that working class poor. And then there's managers and those people with some education and professional degrees who fill in jobs like lawyers and doctors and things like that, who kind of make up a small middle class.
I'm
And
guessing the emphasis here is mainly that it's mainly the rich getting richer, not so much as the poor getting poorer.
the rich are figuring out how to game the system, which is going to eventually lead to the government stepping in. Yes. So the rich are getting richer. Yes. And they're doing it through establishing monopolies. Monopolies are unfair. Like, they're charging way too much. And there's no competition. So there's no way to stop it. So essentially, trying to get back on topic, people begin to get this negative view of the business leaders of America at the time. So even though when we look back on, say, for instance, Rockefeller and others, we call them the titans of industry, they also have another negative name, which they get during this time, called robber barons. They're basically robbing everybody and making off, with all this profit in a very unfair way. And speaking of the Vanderbilts, William Vanderbilt, who was the heir to the fortune of Cornelius Vanderbilt, when people asked him about this, like, don't you care about the public's perception of you? And he said, the public be damned. I don't care. And the rich flaunted their wealth. This is what we call conspicuous consumption, where they were like throwing money around like it was water, and just buying all kinds of ridiculous things. There's a particular story that I remember, off the top of my head from this, where there was this rich heiress who had a little dog, and she bought the dog a $10,000, which, remember, at that time is it's either $10,000 or $15,000 gold and diamond studded collar, while literally outside her building there were children whose parents had died in factory accidents, because there are no regulations about, like, safety in factories at all. They're called street Arabs. They're like literally just homeless children. They're sleeping in the alley and have nothing, and are like living every day just by stealing and whatever they can do. And so you have, like, literally, like, feet from each other, the incredibly rich, just spending over the top, have way more money than they could ever use, like spending on lavish stuff, right next door to people who are literally like desperate, like, on the edge of starvation. Yeah, Zach, what were you gonna say? Zach Vanderbosch, are you?
So I'm guessing that the people, like the poorer people, had a really big grudge against like the rich people, because they were doing all this like extravagant spending with no like means to an end for it. Like, it's just spending to spend.
Right. I mean, there's still some of that today, like, but back then there's a little bit more of an edge to it, because, like, today poor people are poor, but they're not like starving poor. Like, I mean, some people are getting sort of close to that, but, like, back then it was bad. Like, the conditions that some of the poor were living in were just like unbelievable. And so, yes, there was this very negative kind of outlook. It's just that there wasn't a lot of ways for poor people to express themselves, like to get into the media. Like, nowadays, any random person can just throw something on Twitter, or, like, is that what you were going to ask, Zach? I saw your hand go up. And then
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'm guessing that the people now couldn't handle that, like that kind of stuff like that.
The criticism is it goes public much quicker and much easier now, because there's kind of more access for everybody from all social classes. But back then, that wasn't the case. So yeah, but this is the Gilded Age. Now, just remember, we're just talking about the very beginnings of this. This is the Gilded Age is going to continue throughout the late 1800s, like the 1880s, 1890s. As we get into Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, all those guys, we're going to get into kind of, the really heavy parts of the Gilded Age. But this is just, we're just kind of, that's like an overview saying, here it comes. All right. So in 1879, an economist by the name of Henry George published a pioneering book that critiqued capitalism. Okay, because I mean, this is, you know, that big debate that we're still having. Like, what is the best economic system? Like, is it capitalism? Is it communism? Is it socialism? Is it, you know, is it some combination thereof, etc.? And he basically was saying, you know, that the extremes that were created in wealth and poverty were really, you know, just unacceptable. And his book was called Progress and Poverty. It was an instant success, propelled him overnight to fame. And basically, his argument was that as a free market capitalist society grew, and poverty actually got worse rather than better. And he said this is because actually of wealthy people buying up land. And as it went up in value, and as urbanization takes hold, wealthy people basically had a tax-free source of wealth that gave them a stranglehold on space, on natural resources, and he saw that as fundamentally unfair. And so he actually called for something which is being revived in some ways nowadays. He called for a land value tax, which of course is going to become the basis for later for property taxes. But there are people calling for a more kind of extensive, you know, a version of that today as a way of like equaling things out. So the big thing that you do need to remember, though, from Henry George, is that this is where the concept of property taxes is going to come from, which of course is going to fund things like universal public education for students, to give everybody that equal foothold, which of course is going to create a growing middle class, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So definitely some progress there. All right, so as we get into this time period, we're going to see that workers are just going to get sick and tired of being under the boot heel of corporations. And so the question is, how do you fight back effectively? And so one of the less effective ways of fighting back, but which long term, but short term, it seemed very effective, was a way that was pioneered by some Irish mine workers who called themselves the Molly Maguires, after a figure from Irish history. And they were a secret Irish society in the Pennsylvania coal mines. And what they would do is, like, when a new supervisor would come and say, "Hey, we're cutting wages," they would basically be like, "Wow, you know, you need to come down and inspect this area here," and then all of a sudden, that person would have an accident and they would die. So essentially, the way they were fighting back against the corporation, the various mine owners, was to murder these kind of mid management level people who were coming in and trying to enforce wage cuts and other things. And of course, you know, long term this isn't really going to work, but you know, it's short term, it really did seem to provoke some consternation among the companies. And so what they did was they hired the Pinkerton Investigative Agency. Now, you may remember we talked about the Pinkertons already. They got President Lincoln into Washington, D.C. when there was that plot to assassinate him. They're kind of like they're a private security firm that does all kinds of things, and one of the things they do is undercover investigations. And so they bring in this guy named James McParland, and James McParland infiltrates the Molly Maguires by going in as a mine worker and kind of undercover working his way up into their confidence, and finding out who all the top leaders of the Molly Maguires were, and their very top leader, Alexander Campbell. And when he discovers who they all are, he basically exposes them, and they then are arrested, put on trial for murder, and hanged. And that kind of puts an end to the Molly Maguires. But I do have a question here. What does this say about the relationship between labor and business owners, big business owners? Yeah, Elizabeth, go ahead.
Well, the relationship is just getting more and more tense, to the point where they would kill their supervisors. Like they're obviously like building up to what would later be labor unions and that type of thing to
Right.
get themselves fair
There's an
conditions.
incredible amount of tension. Yeah, go ahead, Faith. What were you going to say?
Well, I was just gonna mention, I feel like it stresses the importance of running an ethical business because I feel like with all the wage cuts, they were made by people who could definitely afford to pay their workers. They just wanted to make more money.
Yeah,
So
I
they
mean,
just kept the extra money that they felt they were entitled to instead
yeah,
of paying their workers fairly.
because in the business world, it's cutthroat. Like even today, like it's cutthroat. But like back then, it was really cutthroat because there's no government regulation at all. Like so, businesses can do whatever they want to each other, but they can also do whatever they want to their workers. And of course, they can just fire people and bring in new people if they don't like what the workers are doing. So the workers are so miserable that they're like having to like find ways to try to like fight back. Max, what were you going to say?
It's kind of hitting at what he said in what was Karl Marx's book? Das Kapital,
Yes. Yes.
The humble proletariat's getting a little angry at the rich man, and obviously we're having a violent uprising, I guess you could call it. So
Yeah. And so, I mean, it does seem like things are kind of heading in that direction. And that was one of the big like questions is like in the perfect laboratory of unfettered capitalism, will Karl Marx be proven right? And the Molly Maguires seem to say that's the way things are headed. Ethan, what were you going to say?
Yeah, it seems at this time there's a severe disconnect between the worker and the business owner. Is that basically they're saying like, oh, this guy just wants to literally screw me over at every opportunity. Well, basically the workers are like this guy's working me to the bone. This guy's doing all this while the business owner is basically like, what do you mean they need that money? It's not like it's that expensive. There's like just a severe disconnect from reality between the each other.
Right. And just remember that these guys who a lot of them who start literally from scratch and build their businesses up and become these magnates, these rich and powerful business leaders, their whole mentality is cutthroat because that's how they got to where they are. And of course, they're worried about their competition, but then their own workers are like trying to like force this or that out of them and cut into their profit margins which they're investing in this and that and da da da. And so of course they're gonna treat them poorly. And yeah, so the question is, how can workers get a bigger piece of the pie in a way that is going to last and is not going to blow up in their faces, because obviously murdering people does have consequences.
Yeah, I think the whole mentality is that there's only one size of pie, and it's all about you need to take someone else's slice to get a bigger slice.
Right.
I don't think that whole mentality of make the pie bigger really got to that point until much later.
Yeah. All right. So this just remember, this is kind of setting the stage, and that takes us to the campaign of 1800. All right. So now we need to go back to something we talked about last packet, which is suddenly becoming very important again. Okay. And that is political machines. Okay. So yes, Boss Tweed did start one of the first big political machines in New York City, and he got taken down by the guy who ran for the Democrats in 1876 and almost won, Tilden. But the idea of political machines did not die when Boss Tweed went down. As a matter of fact, it just spread like wildfire all across the country. And it was actually the other party that really became super addicted to political machines, and that was the Republicans. The Republicans were constantly dogged by accusations of corruption, and to a certain extent, they just kind of lived up to it. And so, in the campaign of 1880, the Democrats decide to try to go back to an old tried and true strategy, which is pick a successful general, because they actually had a general who wanted to run as a Democratic candidate. So they picked Winfield Hancock, who the Republicans immediately started doing Oppo research on, and branded as a coward, a man who wanted to give former Confederates their pensions, but et cetera, et cetera. And the Republicans were actually having a behind the scenes battle between two nationwide political machines. So what had happened was political machines had grown beyond like one city. They had mesticized, so to speak, and had gone like they had created like networks of cities that they controlled, or networks where they controlled parts of major cities, and then other parts were controlled by rival political machines. And there were two rival political machines that were like basically big enough to try to engineer the entire election in their favor. Because remember, if you can take the North, you're guaranteed the win, because there just aren't enough votes in the South. Even if it does go fully Democratic, which is what's going to happen now. So there was this impasse between two prominent political machine bosses. The first one is a guy from New York City by the name of Roscoe Conkling. He was like in charge of the customs house in New York City, if I remember right. And just an incredible boss Tweed style political machine boss who had this massive network. And then there was another guy who I may have mentioned earlier by the name of James G. Blaine, who was a politician from Maine, but just had a gift for political intrigue and whatnot. And so he was in charge of another big political machine called the Half-Breeds. And so the two of them basically were blocking each other from getting, the nomination. Blaine wanted the nomination really bad, but Conkling wouldn't let him have it. And finally, like they were on these ballots at their convention, and they're like, we have to pick somebody. So normally when this happens, they go with a dark horse, somebody that is like, there's not a lot of political baggage for that person, especially when it came to allegiance to political machines at this time. And so they went with a former Speaker of the House, James Garfield. You may remember we mentioned him when we talked about the Credit Mobilier scandal, because he had taken a bribe during that scandal. And so the Democrats were scrawling the numbers 329 like everywhere. They would write it on sidewalks, they would write it on doorways, they would write it on the sides of buildings. And that was to basically symbolize the corruption of the Republicans, by basically saying, look, that's the amount of dollars that James Garfield took as a bribe. But the deal was, because Garfield was like a moderate half-breed. He was a half-breed, but he also kind of, saw what the stalwarts wanted and was kind of like, pretty open to their point of view as well. So he's a moderate half-breed, and Conkling agreed to a deal with Blaine that if Garfield got the nomination and was the presidential candidate, that his vice president, Chester Arthur, would be a stalwart, and then the cabinet would be a mix of prominent stalwarts and half-breeds. And so the two political machines are agreeing to kind of share all of the bastions of power in the federal government, the executive White House. and Boatman James Garfield, or Boatman Jim, I'm sorry, as was his moniker, got the nomination for the Republicans. So the Democrats are still kind of banking on everybody like being upset about corruption, and that being the driving force in this election, because it did really like drive their popularity in the last election, even though, you know, their person eventually lost. Um, the Republicans are just out and out looking to fix things. Like they're just using the political machines in the cities to kind of like fix things in their favor. And so we do need to talk about a third party before we talk about what happens in this election. So as we get into this election, there is a party that is like a little populist party. It's kind of made up of a bunch of, you know, your farmers and laborers and mine workers and things like that. People who owed money to other people, who were in debt and wanted a way to pay off their debts that was easier on them than having to pay it off in the most valuable form of currency, which is gold. And so they formed a party around the issue of greenbacks. And so the Greenback Party essentially wants to broaden the circulation of these paper notes, which are supposedly redeemable in gold, but which fluctuate in value more, greenbacks. And every time I have this slide on there, like everybody kind of ignores the whole Greenback Party thing and just focuses in on the very strange beard of Peter Cooper, who is their candidate. That is an odd beard there, but you know, I'm sorry, that's that he was their candidate in 1876 when it was a smaller third party. But then in this election, they nominated James Weaver of Iowa, and broadened their appeal by pushing for federal regulation of railroads and in interstate commerce and an income tax on the rich, all things that appealed to the poorer people of the country. And that really did kind of increase their influence as kind of this third option for the working class. And so in the election of 1876, I'm sorry, 1880, you can see here that the Solid South, which by the way, I have a bracket around here. So make a note of this. This is something that we're going to talk about every time from here on out. What are the lines along which people vote in the South? What is the dividing line between the parties?
Racial
lines. Okay, so since white people are now in charge of the Jim Crow South, their white people are always going to vote for what party?
Democrat.
Yeah, I mean, and why is that? Like, why would they not vote Republican?
Because Republican Party was, you know, Lincoln, and still Civil War ideals were still alive.
Right. Yeah. They're never going to vote for the party of Lincoln, like the party that wanted to end slavery. I mean, they still see Lincoln as the guy who ended slavery, you know, and just kind of destroyed the Southern way of life, etc. So the Solid South is always going to vote Democrat. And that is going to be true all the way up until we get into, like, I mean, there are going to be some hiccups, you know, that are economically related in like the 20s and 30s. But eventually it'll change in the 1960s. So there's going to be a good, you know, 80-ish years of dominance by the Republican, I'm sorry, the Democrats in the South. Yeah,
Are you talking about that Southern switch?
Yes.
In the 60s.
Right. And I don't want to get into too much detail on that right now because we'll get to it. So, you know, let's, you know, we don't want to like jump ahead in the story too much, but yeah, the parties will eventually kind of switch in terms of, you know, how the races vote in the 60s. It'll have to do with the civil rights movement, Lyndon B. Johnson in particular, etc. But Yeah, that is the election of 1880. And really, the Republicans swing this by engineering victories in major cities in the North, in with political machines. So there's a lot of corruption in this election. I mean, just bottom line, there is. And you can see that there are some kind of northern states that go Democrat, like New Jersey goes Democrat, because the issue of corruption is a big deal, but it's definitely something that um, this is a corrupt election. I see two hands here. Max, you were first. Go ahead.
That very southern tip of California, why is that in specific red?
That's what we call a faithless elector. That is someone who was on that slate of electors. You know how like in this last election, they had like a slate of electors from like the state of Pennsylvania that were Democrats, and they all cast their electoral votes for the Democrat Party. Well, what if one of those people suddenly decided, you know what? I think the Republicans won, and they just voted Republican instead. That happens every once in a while, because literally, like, once that person is chosen as an elector, even though they're expected to be loyal to their party, and they're throwing away their future in the party if they do the opposite, it occasionally happens where there's just what we call a faithless elector, and they vote for somebody else. So yeah. And was that everybody else had that same question? I saw Brady's hand.
Yeah, I know. I had the same question.
Oh, okay. All right. So yeah, so that is basically kind of what that's all about. And that brings into office our 20th president, James Garfield.
I'm noticing how short it is.
Yes, and it is going to be very interesting, because we're going to talk about well, I won't say it yet, because I want to get to it on the next slide. But we're going to talk about a rather dramatic incident, which has some interesting kind of theories surrounding it. But remember, what was the deal? Does anybody remember what was the deal between the two political machine leaders? Who are the two political machine leaders, by the way?
The half-breeds and the stalwarts.
Stalwarts. Who's the leader of the half-breeds?
It was oh yeah, James G. Blaine.
James G. Blaine, okay, that politician from Maine who is like this political, intrigue genius. And then who's the guy who's in charge of the stalwart political machine?
Roscoe Conkling.
Roscoe Conkling.
So it wasn't the VP is one of the stalwarts.
Right. The VP is a stalwart, and the president is a half-breed. And the deal was that when Garfield takes that oath of office and is inaugurated, he is going to start appointing cabinet officials that please both of the political machines. Well, James G. Blaine, he basically played Roscoe Conkling here, because as soon as Garfield takes office, he starts just putting in half-breeds. Like, James G. Blaine becomes the Secretary of State, which is the most coveted of all of the cabinet positions. And half-breeds basically end up just kind of taking over everything. And so the stalwarts are just out, and they actually like even try to force Roscoe Conkling out of his position in New York City. And Blaine tries to just do like a hostile takeover in terms of like, his political machine being the boss political machine. And so Garfield is kind of betraying his fellow Republicans who are stalwarts there. And so while Garfield is waiting at a train station one day, a man by the name of Charles Guteau comes up behind him. Now remember, at this time there is no Secret Service, there is no protection for the president, and oftentimes the president would take civilian transportation.
Yeah, I think I've heard this story about the assassination. It was like there are two guys, I think.
Oh
There's
no,
like two of
just
them.
let me tell it, and then you can jump in and with the theories and stuff. First, what happens is Guteau walks up behind the president. The president's just waiting for the train along with a crowd of people, and he just has a gun in his coat, and he just pulls it out and he shoots Garfield in the back. So he shoots him in the back, and Garfield collapses, and right before the crowd tackles Guteau yells, "I'm a stalwart. Arthur is now president." And then he gets tackled to the ground. Okay. And of course, arrested, etc. So now Garfield is not dead. He is wounded badly and bleeding. So initial picture, just from what you see here, what does it look like has just happened? Why was Garfield shot?
He was shot so that stalwarts could take over the presidency, allegedly.
All right, yeah, like
that's basically political corruption at its peak.
Yeah, like this is like, like top level political corruption, like the stalwarts are essentially like, getting their revenge on the half-breeds, etc. And so that's what it looks like. It's in the newspapers, everybody's like reporting it, it's like, people are wondering if Roscoe Conkling is going to be arrested and all this stuff. And before I tell you about what happens in the trial of Charles Guteau, I want to tell you about what happens with the president and his wound. So the president is taken back to the White House, and he is in agony. There is a bullet inside of his torso, and he is in constant, agony. He's laying on this bed, and the doctors are like, okay, the way to relieve his suffering is to get the bullet out. So they start digging in there with their hands. Now, some of these doctors are aware of the germ theory of disease. Others are not. So just remember, not all medical professionals are at the same level here. So some of them have not effectively cleaned their hands and basically when they stick their fingers in there trying to find the bullet, they're infecting all of his internal organs. And so the wound gets way worse. I mean, he's basically in agony for literally 11 weeks as this thing fills up with pus, and the infection just gets huge, and it's just incredibly, like, it is the most painful, horrible, agonizing way that any president has ever died. And they even bring in a metal detector, because Alexander Graham Bell had invented a metal detector. It's like one of those things where if you're searching for like mines, or if you're searching for like buried treasure, you just swing it across the ground, and it's like boom, boom, beep, 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 it beeps when it's right by some metal. And so they were like they were doing that over the president. They were doing a metal detector, and it beeped, and they're like, oh, that's where it is. And so they like dig way up in there, and he's like, he's in all this pain. And they're like, there's nothing there. There's nothing there. And it's like, what's going on here? And they're like, oh, wait a minute, that was a bed spring underneath him. So, it's just this like unbelievably agonizing 11 weeks of just slowly this infection getting worse and worse and worse. And then eventually President Garfield dies of blood poisoning from just the septic, backlash from this infection. And yeah, Brady, go ahead.
So I'm aware this isn't like the shortest term from a president, or I don't think it is.
No,
but
William Henry Harrison, with only 30 days in office, dying of pneumonia, is the shortest. But yes, go
that's
ahead.
right. But is this like the shortest because of an assassination, or is it like close to one of the shortest?
Yeah, in other words, if you were talking about like presidential terms cut short by assassination, yes, this would be the shortest term due to an assassination. So very good. Yes, Ethan.
So are you about at the end of the whole thing?
So
About
do you want to go with a theory on Guteau?
Okay, so technically there was two guys. I only know the story of one guy, and
Right.
he's the supposed, state-of-the-art whack job in those sort of attempts. I'm pretty sure the other one was like a very invested political, basically you do this. But the much more interesting story, I think it was basically he was the type of guy who tried to become a political figure, but then found out he really wasn't good at it. And
You're talking about Charles Guteau? You're talking about the guy who fired the bullet into the president's back?
I don't know if it was one or the other. I can't remember the name.
Right.
It was been a while since I
let me
saw
kind
about
of
it.
flesh this out, because you're hitting some of the aspects of the story, but some of the aspects you're hitting are theories. Okay, so Guteau was put on trial, and everybody was expecting this to be spectacular. Like, okay, there is going to be a shadowy behind the scenes operative who is going to connect Guteau to Roscoe Conkling, and it's going to lead to the arrests, like of all these top stalwarts for assassinating the president. But then the new president, of course, is going to probably quash it, and there's all this speculation as to the intrigue that's going to go on. But as the trial goes on, it becomes obvious that there is something wrong with Guteau. Guteau is like, basically like, they bring out some evidence. Like, he had written a letter to James G. Blaine, the Secretary of State, saying, yeah, I made some speeches.
Oh yeah, I remember that part.
Yeah, I made some speeches in favor of the Republicans, and so I want to be ambassador to Paris.
Yeah, there's that. Okay, so yeah, basically it's just a story of a guy begging everybody. He's like, please give me a political position. Any position will do.
Well,
It's like, okay,
but
no,
if
it's like,
but if you expect something that's completely and utterly unrealistic, what are you essentially? If you say, I'm just going to do this, and then I expect to be rewarded with this giant reward, and you just expect it, what is the conclusion about Guteau that we eventually come to as this trial goes forward?
basically is found as basically a manic dude who found that I gotta kill Garfield so I can get this position for some reason.
Which means he's what? He's insane.
Oh yeah, he's basically declared insane.
He's insane.
And then sent to asylum.
No, like, okay, well, no. So basically, Guteau, as the trial goes forward, the people begin to realize this guy is off his rocker. Like, because like Blaine had written him a letter back saying, I don't even know who you are. We never asked you to make any speeches, and you wouldn't get that kind of appointment anyway from making those kind of speeches. So never write to me again. And so, like, after a couple of attempts, Guteau just suddenly decides he's going to switch, and what he is hoping for is that Chester Arthur, because he actually had visited the prison that he was going to be, put in, and he had to see how comfortable it was. He expected Chester Arthur, out of gratitude for Guteau making him president, to pardon him and then give him this job. And of course, that is ludicrous. Like, that's not going to happen. And so, like, as the trial goes forward, people realize there is no conspiracy. This guy is just a lone nut. Okay, yeah. Now, there are people who still theorize that this is just a very clever cover-up and that there really was one. But most historians, when they're looking at the evidence and they're looking at the trial transcripts, and they're just like, no, this guy he's Looney Tunes. Okay. And essentially, the you know, the jury finds him guilty. And even though he is insane, because he has assassinated a president, they execute him anyway. And so basically that is the end of President Garfield and his assassin, Charles Guteau. And that basically is it. This whole episode is going to cause an outcry against the system known as the spoils system, which has been around ever since the time of Andrew Jackson, where if you work for a political party, you get paid back according to how much work you do with a government job. That's the way to reward people for working for your campaign. And so this is going to cause a public backlash against the spoil system. And we really don't have time to get into what is going to happen with Chester Arthur and his reaction to all of this. So we're going to wait on that until I see you guys in class tomorrow. But Dylan, did you have a question? Go ahead.
Has a president ever been assassinated or effectively removed from office by a terrorist group?
A terrorist group? No, but there was an attempt that almost succeeded against President Truman by some Puerto Rican like independence fighters, some people who wanted Puerto Rico to get its independence, and they tried to assassinate President Truman and almost succeeded. As far as terror groups and presidential assassinations, that's the closest that, just off the top of my head, that a group has ever come. There may be something that I'm not remembering, but I'm pretty sure that's probably the closest.
Yeah, the whole story of Garfield is in stark contrast of what happened with Teddy Roosevelt later. It was like, oh no, the president got shot. It's gonna be Garfield over again. Oh no, I'm fine. I'm just gonna make my speech.
Oh, you're talking
Like,
about?
yeah, I got a bullet in my chest.
Now, Teddy Roosevelt comes into office because his predecessor, William McKinley, is assassinated, but there is an assassination attempt on Teddy Roosevelt where he is shot in the chest while he's making a speech in Milwaukee as a third party candidate. He's not president at the time. He's running for president for the Bull Moose or Progressive Party, and he had a steel eyeglasses case, which the bullet just so happened to hit perfectly. Like, it hit that and then it like grazed off and like dug into his chest muscle, but didn't like penetrate into his organs or anything. And so he got shot. Everybody in the crowd was like screaming. They're like, oh, no, Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah, I think he even talked about it like in the middle of the speech, like, I got shot, but I'm still standing here.
No. It's one of my favorite stories in all of history. He's like, he gets up after a little bit. He brushes himself off. There's like a trickle of blood running down his shirt, like from the chest wound. And he gets back up on stage, and he says it takes more than one bullet to kill a bull moose. And that's just like, political like stardom.
I mean, yeah, people like to say that. It's like, yeah, that man was just that strong. That's why he survived, obviously, even though like supreme luck.
It played into his image like that he already had from earlier on. But yeah, it just like, and of course that's where the Progressive Party becomes known as the Bull Moose Party. And like, I'll show you the political cartoons and everything.
Yeah.
But yeah, so anyway, but
I mean, did he use like a 38 caliber pistol though?
Yeah, we have to stop.
It wasn't that powerful.
Right. But we have to stop here for today. And we will pick up on this when I see you guys on Monday. So I've been kind of following the game on my phone here as we've gone. So I see that it's been a pretty good game so far. So I'm going to go and catch the third and fourth quarters. And I will see you all on Monday. Have a great day, rest of your day.